Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy for a presentation by one of the most respected commentators on global affairs. As many of you know, this year the Institute is commemorating its 25th anniversary, and this lecture is one of the many special events we are hosting in honor of this landmark. This afternoon's speaker, Tom Friedman, is no stranger to the Baker Institute. He has given lectures at the Institute in 1999, shortly after our beginning, and 2012, and we are grateful to welcome him again as we begin our next quarter century of growth. Now, Tom and I served in Beirut. I have a lot of information on him that cannot be disclosed, and he has a lot of information on me that can't be disclosed, and that's why he comes, because I have something on him. At a moment when we are consistently inundated with information on how the world around us is changing before our eyes, lucid commentary on these changes is desperately needed. Fortunately, Tom has supplied us with this in his latest book, Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. In this work, Tom diagnoses how technology, globalization, and climate change are growing forces that are changing everything from our local communities to political trends across the world. At the same time, Tom speaks on how promoting thoughtfulness and trust can remedy the challenges of our fast-paced world. Tom's work with the New York Times has earned him 3 separate Pulitzer Prizes, accolades that speak to his skills in reporting and analyzing complex international events. In addition to Thank You for Being Late, he's the author of other highly acclaimed books. My favorite, as a veteran diplomat in the Middle East myself, I can testify to the impact of works such as his 1989 book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, which is a classic. Today, Tom continues to produce ideas that can demystify the challenges facing our world today in a way that readers of all stripes can comprehend. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tom Friedman to the podium. He will take questions from the audience. Keep them short. Please don't make speeches. And welcome, Tom.
Thank you. It's really a treat to be back here at the Baker Institute. So great to see the Secretary and Susan here. I had the pleasure of traveling almost all 750,000 miles with that guy. So we know each other very well. Okay? And it was also a pleasure to cover, I think, one of the truly consequential Secretaries of State in our history. And I'm here to honor him. What I'm going to do in my talk is really try to explain to you how I look at the world today, how I go about organizing my thoughts and writing columns at this moment in time. One of my great teachers, Lynn Wells, always likes to say, never think in the box today, never think out of the box. Today you must think without a box. And what I'm going to show you this afternoon is how I go about thinking without a box to explain the biggest global trends shaping our lives today. So the first question I always get on my book is, thank you for being late. Where does the title come from? And the title actually comes from meeting people in Washington, D.C. for breakfast where I live. I often schedule business breakfast downtown. I don't like to eat alone if I'm downtown when I can be learning from someone. And every once in a while, someone comes 10, 15 minutes late. And they say, Tom, I'm really sorry. It was the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. And 3.5 years ago, Peter Corcell, an energy entrepreneur, actually came to a breakfast 15 minutes late and did the usual, Tom, I'm really sorry. It's the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. And I just spontaneously said to him, actually, Peter, thank you for being late. Because you were late, I've been eavesdropping on their conversation. Fascinating. I've been people watching the lobby. Fantastic. And best of all, I just connected 2 ideas I've been struggling with for a month. So thank you for being late. Well, people started to get into it. They'd say, well, you're welcome, because they understood I was actually giving them permission to pause, to slow down, to reflect. In fact, my favorite quote from the front of the book is from my teacher, Dov Seidman, who says, when you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, it starts. That's when it starts to reflect, rethink, and reimagine. And boy, don't we need to be doing a lot of that today. Now, this book was actually triggered, quite accidentally, when I paused and engaged with someone I wouldn't normally engage with. So my wife Ann and I live out in Bethesda, Maryland, and I actually take the subway to work. I work out of the Washington Bureau of the New York Times down near the White House, and I take the subway to work around once a week. 3.5 years ago now, I took the subway to work. That means driving from our home on Bradley Boulevard in Bethesda. I park at the Bethesda Hyatt. There's a public parking garage beneath the Bethesda Hyatt. I take the red line into DC. So I parked my car, got my timestamp ticket, took the red line in, spent the day at the New York Times, red line back, car, timestamp ticket, drove to the cashier's booth, handed the cashier my ticket. He looked at it and looked at me and said, "I know who you are." I said, "Great. Parking guy reads my column." He said, "I read your column, but I don't always agree." I thought, get me the hell out of here. No, but I said, no, that's good. It means you always have to check. And I drove off thinking, parking guy reads my column. It's kind of cool. A week later, I took my weekly trip into DC. Parking garage, timestamp ticket, red line, DC, office day, New York Times, red line back, car, timestamp ticket, cashier's booth, same guy's there. This time he says, "Mr. Friedman, I have my own blog. Would you read my blog?" I thought, oh my God, the parking guy is now my competitor. What just happened? So I said, well, write it down for me and I'll look it up. So he tore off a piece of receipt paper and wrote on it odanambi.com. I got home, I fired up my computer, looked it up immediately. Turns out he's Ethiopian, writes about Ethiopia from the perspective of the Oromo people, a real democracy advocate. It was a little rough, but it was pretty good. Anyways, I told my wife Ann about it and thought about him for a day, and I decided, you know what? This is a sign from God. I should pause and engage this guy. But I didn't have his email, so the only thing I could do was park in the parking garage every day, which I did for 4 days. We eventually overlapped at 7 in the morning. I parked under the gate so it couldn't come down. I got out of my car. I said, Ayile, now I know his name, Ayile Bogia, I want your email. I want to send you a message, which he tore off another piece of receipt paper and gladly gave to me. And that evening we began an email exchange. I saved them all. They're all in the front of the book. They're kind of funny. Because I basically said to him, I have a proposition for you. I will teach you how to write a column in the New York Times if you will tell me your life story. And he basically said, I see you're proposing a deal. I like this deal. So we agreed to meet 2 weeks later at Pete's Coffee House in Bethesda. I came with a 6-page memo on how to write a column for the New York Times, and he came with his life story. An Ethiopian grad of Haile Selassie University in Addis Ababa in economics, was a political activist for democracy and the Oromo people in Ethiopia. He eventually got thrown out of the country by the government. We welcomed him in America as a political exile. He was blogging on Ethiopian websites. I discovered a lot about the University of Ethiopian websites, but he told me they were just too slow. They wouldn't turn his stuff around fast enough. So he decided to start his own blog, and he told me, now, Mr. Friedman, I feel empowered. His Google metrics say he's read in 30 different countries. This is my parking attendant. And it's a wonderful story about how anyone today can participate in the global conversation. And he's a wonderful man, and we have stayed friends. I then presented him with a 6-page memo on how to write a column for the New York Times. I explained to him that a news story is meant to inform. I could write a news story about this talk, and Secretary Baker and Ed would tell me whether I inform better or worse. But what I do, opinion writing, column writing, is meant to provoke. Meant to provoke a reaction. I'm either in the heating business or the lighting business. That's what I do. I'm either doing a heating or a lighting. I'm either illuminating something for you or stoking up an emotion in you. And if I really do my job well, I do both and create heat and light. And I know that I've been successful by whatever reaction I get. Some people read my column and say, I didn't know that. That's good. I provided some light. Some people read it and say, I never connected those things. That's good. More light. Some people read it and say, I never looked at it that way. More light. Your favorite, you live for this as a columnist, happens 6 times a year at the most. People read your column and say, you said exactly what I was feeling, but didn't know how to say. God bless you. God bless you. I want to kill you dead, you and all your offspring. I get that too. That means I produce some heat, okay? Got a little of that lately too. But I explained to Ayile that to produce heat and light requires actually a chemical reaction. And you have to combine 3 chemicals. First is, what is your value set? What are the set of values and principles that you as a columnist are trying to push out into the world? Are you a communist, a capitalist, a neocon, a neoliberal, a libertarian, a Marxist, a Keynesian? What's the animating value set that you're trying to promote? Second, how do you think the machine works? And this will be the guts of my talk this afternoon. So the machine for me is, what are the biggest forces shaping more things in more places in more ways on more days? What do the big gears and pulleys of the world look like today? My work as a journalist is an endless project of trying to understand how the machine works. Why? Because as a columnist, I'm trying to take my values and push the machine in their direction. And if I don't understand how the machine works, I either won't push it or I'll push it in the wrong direction. And lastly, what have you learned about people and culture? Because there's no column without people. There are no people without culture. How do different peoples and cultures react when the machine moves? And how does their reaction come back and affect the machine? Stir those 3 together, let it rise, bake for 45 minutes, and if you do it right, you too can write a column for the New York Times. Well, the more I explained this to Ayile, the more I started to step back and say to myself, well, if that's what a column's about, I'd never put this together until I did it for him. I thought, well, what is my value set? Now, those of you who read me know is that I'm not quite a liberal, I'm certainly not a conservative. It's because my values actually emerged from the small town in Minnesota where I grew up in the 50s and 60s at a time and place when politics worked. And nothing has influenced me more than that little town and the values it instilled in me. How do I think the machine works today? And what have I learned about people and culture? And that's what Thank You for Being Late is all about. The first half is about how the machine works, and the second half is about how this machine is not just changing your world, it's reshaping your world. And it's reshaping, as we speak, 5 realms: the workplace, politics, geopolitics, ethics. Yeah, we're going to talk about ethics this afternoon, and community. So let me first talk a little bit about how the machine works. So what I think is shaping more things in more places in more ways on more days is that we are right now in the middle of 3 giant accelerations with the 3 largest forces on the planet all at the same time, which I call the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. So let me explain. So Mother Nature for me is climate change, biodiversity loss, and population growth in the developing world. If you put all of them on a graph, they actually look like a giant hockey stick. They look like Glacier National Park 1913, Glacier National Park 2012. By the way, that glacier's been there for 7,000 years. They look like Lake Chad 1963, that big blue thing up there, and Lake Chad 2013, that little blue patch down there. They look like a graph of global average temperature, a hockey stick. They look like a graph of instances of extreme weather since 1988, another hockey stick. I don't have to tell Houstonians. They look like the mother of all hockey sticks, a graph of global population growth throughout history. The market, for me, is globalization, but not your grandfather's globalization. That was containers on ships and planes. What is driving globalization today is digital globalization. Through everything is being digitized and globalized through Facebook, PayPal, Twitter, MOOCs. Put digital globalization on a graph and you get some more hockey sticks, total data consumed per month. You get mobile cellular subscriptions in the US. You get global internet users. You get another hockey stick. And Moore's Law, coined by Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel, in 1965, in a famous article in Electronics magazine, argued that the speed and power of microchips will double roughly every 24 months, and the price will actually stay the same or go down. Gordon Moore coined that theorem 53 years ago. And for the last 53 years, every year, you could set your watch by it, someone wrote an article saying Moore's Law is over. And what all those authors have in common is that they were all wrong. Moore's Law is alive and well, doubling every 2 years the speed and power of microchips. Now this PowerPoint, I suspect, is running on an Intel 14 nanometer chip. It has 37.5 million transistors per square millimeter. Your eye can't see it. Intel in January came out under Moore's Law with their 10 nanometer chip. It has 100 million transistors per square millimeter. And the people at Intel can tell you exactly how they're going to make the 7 nanometer chip. Now, when you keep doubling something in technology and doubling it and doubling it and doubling it, you eventually get to some very high numbers. What's the difference between a 14 nanometer chip and a 10 nanometer chip? It's very abstract. Actually, it's the difference between a self-driving car that needs the whole trunk of the car, to contain the brains of that car, going to a self-driving car that just needs a little box under the front seat to contain the brains of that car. You know, back in the Middle Ages, there's a famous story that the man who invented the game of chess came to the king, gave the game to the king. He loved it. Told the man he really wanted to reward him, said, "What would you like, good sir?" Famous story they tell in Silicon Valley. And the man said, "Well, your highness, I'd actually just like to feed my family." And he said, "Well, that's no problem. What would you like?" He said, "I'd actually like you to take 1 kernel of rice, put it on the first square of this chessboard, 2 on the next, 4 on the next, 8 on the next, 16 on the next, 32 on the next. My family will be fine." The king said, "It shall be done," not realizing that when you double something just 63 times, the number you get is roughly 18 quintillion, more rice than existed in the world. Now, my friends Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson, in their great book, The Second Machine Age, point out that we just entered, with microchips, the second half of the chessboard, where you start to see some really funky stuff. You start to see cars that can drive themselves and computers that can defeat any human in any game, including Chess, Jeopardy, and Go. A few years ago, Intel, to try to explain the power of Moore's Law, took a 1971 Volkswagen Beetle, and they asked their engineers to try to estimate, what if this Volkswagen Beetle had improved at the same rate of microchips? And they estimated that if it had today, that Volkswagen Beetle would go 300,000 miles an hour, it would get 2 million miles per gallon, and it would cost you 4 cents. That's the power of the technological exponential now driving our lives. And the simple theme of my book is that these 3 accelerations in the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law are now all interacting with one another. More Moore's Law drives more globalization drives more climate change and more solutions. And together they are not just changing your world. Get that out of your head. They're reshaping your world. Politics, geopolitics, ethics, the workplace, and community. So I'm going to do a little deeper dive on Moore's Law because it's really the Uber driver of all of these. We'll leave climate change and the market aside for a moment. You can bring it up in questions. So my chapter actually on Moore's Law is called What the Hell Happened in 2007? What the hell happened in 2007? I know what you're all thinking. 2007, such an innocuous year. What's this guy talking about? Well, here's what happened in 2007. The year was kicked off on January 9th at the Moscone Center in San Francisco when this guy named Steve Jobs introduced the first one of these babies. This is actually a handheld computer with more compute power in it than the Apollo space mission, and they tell me that it doubles as a phone and a camera. Okay, that's how the year was kicked off. In 2007, actually late 2006, a company called Facebook opened its platform to anyone with a registered email address. And in 2007, Facebook went global because old farts like you and me could suddenly be on Facebook with all our high school and college kids. In 2007, a company called Twitter split off on its own independent platform and went global. In 2007, the most important software you've never heard of called VMware. VMware is what enables any operating system to work on any computer. It's the basis of cloud computing. VMware went public. In 2007, the second most important software you've never heard of called GitHub opened its doors. GitHub today is the largest repository of open source software with 14 million users. For the techies among you, you will appreciate the irony of that it was just bought by Microsoft. In 2007, maybe actually the most important software you've never heard of, called Hadoop, was launched into the wild. Hadoop is what enables 1 million computers to work together as if they're one. I think that's called big data. Hadoop didn't invent those algorithms. They're invented by Google. They're called GFS and MapReduce. But as Doug Cutting, the founder of Hadoop, explains in the book, Google lives in the future and sends us letters back home. And what Google did was leave a trail of breadcrumbs of its big data algorithms for the open source community. They reversed engineered it, and Hadoop became the free public version of it, and every one of your companies, including the Baker Institute, is running on it right now. In 2007, a company called Google bought a little-known TV company called YouTube. And in 2007, the same company, Google, launched into the wild its own operating system. They called it Android. In 2007, IBM launched the world's first cognitive computer. They called it Watson. In 2007, a company called Netflix streamed its first video. In 2007, an obscure Japanese cryptocurrency expert wrote an essay launching a cryptocurrency. It turned out to be something they'd call Bitcoin. In 2007, 3 design students attending the design conference in San Francisco that year noticed that all the hotel rooms were sold out. But one of them had 3 spare air mattresses. And they thought it might be cool if they rented out their air mattresses to people who couldn't get hotel rooms. And it worked out so well for them. In 2007, they started a company called Airbnb. That's why it's called Airbnb, because of the founding 3 air mattresses. In 2007, the internet crossed 1 billion users. Late 2006 seems to have been a tipping point. Here's what else happened in 2007. This is a graph of the cost of sequencing a human genome. You'll notice it was $100 million in 2001. It falls to $10 million in 2006. And then you'll notice the graph goes off a cliff like an EKG heading for a heart attack in 2007, and the price of sequencing a human genome falls to $10,000. In 2007, this is a graph of solar energy. Something called solar energy took off, as did a process that Houstonians are familiar with called fracking. Between 2006 and 2008, America's natural gas reserves increased by 35%, a staggering number for an 18-month period. This is a graph of social networks. So the white line going down, that's the cost of generating a megabit of data, and you'll notice it goes from $8 to $2 in 1 year. 2007. The blue line is the speed of transmitting that data, and the two lines cross in 2008. My favorite, this is a graph of cloud computing, how much revenue it generates. You'll notice the first year we have statistics is 2008, which pretty much means the cloud was born in 2007. In 2007, Intel for the first time went off silicon to extend Moore's law. They introduced non-silicon materials into their microchips. In 2005, a Texan named Michael Dell, founder of Dell Computers, retired. And in 2007, he told me he decided he had to come back to work. Turns out, friends, I believe 2007 will be understood in time as one of the greatest technological inflection points since Gutenberg. And we completely missed it. Why did we miss it? Because of 2008. Yeah, right when our physical technologies just took off, like we were on a speeding sidewalk in an airport that suddenly went from 5 to 50 miles an hour, right when that happened, our social technologies, the political reform, regulatory reform, education reform, management reform you would need for such an acceleration of technology, they all froze because we entered the deepest recession since 1929. And in that gap, between what happened to our physical technologies and what happened to our social technologies between 2007 and 2008, many Trump and Brexit voters were born because millions of people got completely dislocated in that gap. So what actually happened in 2007? Well, my argument is that if you take this computer here, it actually has 5 key components. It's got that Moore's law processor, it's got a storage chip, it's got networking, it's got software, and it's got a sensor, it's got a camera. Those are the 5 key components of all computers. And what I do in the book is trace the history of all 5 and show how all 5 have been in their own little Moore's laws, and they all melded together, I believe, around 2007 into this thing we call the cloud. The cloud. But I never use the term the cloud in my book, because it sounds so fluffy, so soft, so cuddly, so benign. Sounds like a Joni Mitchell song. I've looked at clouds from both sides. This ain't no cloud, folks. This is what the science students among you and I call a supernova. The supernova is the largest force in nature. It's the explosion of a star. Because I think what happened in 2007 was a release of energy, an explosion of energy into the hands of men, women, and machines, the likes of which we have never seen before, and it changed 4 kinds of power almost overnight. First, it changed the power of one. What one person can do today as a maker or a breaker is unlike anything we've ever seen before. We have a president who can sit in his pajamas in the White House living quarters and tweet directly to 1 billion people without an editor, a libel lawyer, or a filter, okay? I'm not going there, I'm just stating a fact, okay? But you know what's really scary? I'll tell you what's really scary. The head of ISIS can do the exact same thing from his bunker in Raqqa province in Syria. The power of one today to be a maker or a breaker is unlike anything we have ever seen before. The power of machines have changed. Machines now have all 5 senses. We've never lived in a world where machines could speak, talk, listen, hear, and reason. We've never lived in such a world. We crossed that line of all places on a game show, February 14th, 2011. You may have seen it. There were 3 contestants. 2 were the all-time Jeopardy champions. The 3rd contestant simply went by his last name, Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson, of course, was an IBM cognitive computer. Mr. Watson was very kind. He let the 2 humans answer the first question. But he buzzed in before them on the second question. See if you can get it. The question was, it's worn on the foot of a horse and used by a dealer in a casino. And in under 2.5 seconds, Mr. Watson said in perfect Jeopardy style, an artificially generated human voice, what is a shoe? What is a shoe? And for the first time, we all got to watch live on television a cognitive computer solve a pun riddle faster than two human beings. And the world kind of hasn't been the same since. It's changed the power of flows. Ideas now flow, change, circulate, congeal, recongeal faster than we've ever seen before. It can be around issues like the Confederate flag or gay rights, you name it. But the way ideas now flow, melt, and circulate and recongeal is faster than ever. Where did you want to build your home, your town in the Middle Ages? You wanted to build it on a river because the flows of that river brought you food, ideas, sustenance, and power. You wanted to build your town on the Amazon. Where do you want to build your town today? On Amazon.com. On the digital flows, because they are what will provide you all of those same assets. And lastly, it changed the power of many. Because when men, women, machines get disempowered, we become the largest forcing function on and in nature, which is why the new climate era has been named for us, the Anthropocene. My argument is these four changes in power, I repeat, they are not just reshaping your world. They are not just changing your world, they are reshaping your world. Politics, geopolitics, ethics, the community, and the workplace. So let's talk about those realms, at least some of them. Let's start by talking about the workplace. But before we do, I just want to share with you a little graph that was drawn for me by Astro Teller. So Astro Teller is runs Google X, Google's research arm. His title there is Chief Astronaut. Astro is a grandson of Nobel Prize winners. He really smart guy. I went out to see him with the theory of my book. And I laid it out to him. And he went over and took 3 magic markers and went over to his whiteboard and he drew this. This is just a crude made-up graph. But I said, what's that, Astro? He said, well, that blue line across the middle, that's the average rate at which human beings and societies and Houstonians adapt to change over time. Okay? So you'll notice the graph has a positive slope, but it's very gradual. The white line, I said, what's that? He said, that's technology. So you'll notice over here in the 11th and 12th century, it's very flat. Because your bow and arrow did not get better over a whole century. We forget how slow technology change was. There was no bow and arrow 2.0 in the 12th century, okay? But then we had the scientific revolution, Copernicus and Galileo, and then eventually Steve Jobs and Intel and Microsoft, and the line starts to go straight north. And then he drew that little diamond there. I said, what's that, Astro? He said, Tom, that's where we are. We're at a point now where technology is evolving faster than the average community can adapt to. Then he took out another magic marker and he drew that little dotted line there. And I said, what's that, Astro? He said, that's learning faster and governing smarter. And that is the challenge of every community, every Rice University, every parent. How do we learn faster and govern smarter to meet technology where it's going for more of our citizens? And that's why my chapter on the workplace is called How Do We Turn AI into IA? How do we take artificial intelligence and turn it into intelligent assistance, ANCE, intelligent assistance, ANTS, and intelligent algorithms so more people can learn faster and govern smarter. Excuse me. So let me give you an example of each one. My chapter on intelligent assistance is built around a good Texas company called ATT. So I spent a real lot of time down in Dallas with AT&T in their human resources department. I happen to know Randall Stevenson, and he really opened their doors to me, and they have one of the most interesting HR departments in the country. So their HR policy is very simple. You know, AT&T, giant global telecom, living right on the edge of the supernova, competing in this hyper-competitive space of global telecom. Pretty good chance that whatever is going on at AT&T HR department, coming to a company near you. So what's going on there? Well, they begin their year now every year with a pretty radically transparent speech by Randall Stevenson outlining what businesses the company is going to be in that year and what skills you're going to need to be a rising employee at AT&T that year. Then they took all 110,000 of their managers, they put them on their own in-house LinkedIn system. So if I were an ATT manager, I'd be there, I'd show my academic background, my work things, my work skills where I've learned, and then it matches those up against a list of, I'm making up the number, but say 10 skill sets that AT&T thinks you need to be a rising employee that year. Turns out I've got 7 of the 10, but I'm missing 3. Then they partnered with Sebastian Thrun from Udacity, the online learning program, and they got Udacity to build nano degrees, online skill degrees for all 10 skill sets, including the 3 I'm missing. Then they came to me and said, Tom, here's the deal. We will give you up to $8,000 a year to take the nano degree courses for the skills you're missing. In fact, we heard you're interested in the Middle East. You want to take a course in archaeology. We'll pay for that as well. In fact, we heard you have an interest in computing. We just created a $6,000 a year online master's degree in computer science with Georgia Tech. We're in for that as well. Just one condition, Mr. Tom. You have to take all these courses at home, at night, on weekends, on your own time, not on Ma Bell's time. Now, I may say, you know what, I've actually climbed up one too many telephone poles. I'm just not interested in spending my weekends that way. In which case, AT&T now has a wonderful severance package for you, okay? But you will not be working at AT&T most likely much longer. What is AT&T's new social contract with their employees? It's very simple. You can be a lifelong employee at AT&T, but only if you're a lifelong learner. If you are no longer ready to be a lifelong learner, you can no longer be a lifelong employee at AT&T. And that, friends, is the new social contract coming to a neighborhood near you. Which is why one of my real teachers, Heather McGowan, likes to say to parents today, Mom, Dad, never ask your kids anymore what you want to be when you grow up. Because whatever it is will not be here unless it's policeman or fireman, okay? Only ask your kids today how you want to be when you grow up. Will you have an agile learning mindset? Will you want to be a lifelong learner? Because there's stuff you're going to learn in your first year at Rice now that will be outdated by your 4th year. And that is why another of my teachers, Marina Gorbis, likes to tell people, you know, if I were giving this talk 10 years ago, and maybe I did when I was here 10 years ago, I would have said, we got to talk about the digital divide. You know, Houston's got the internet and upstate Texas doesn't. All right, upstate New York doesn't have internet, New York City does. America's got internet and Cameroon doesn't. There was a digital divide in the world and it was hugely consequential. I believe the digital divide in the next 5 years will be pretty much erased. That anyone who wants a network connection will be able to have one. And when that happens, says Marina, the most important divide in the world is going to be the self-motivation divide. Whose kids have the self-motivation to be lifelong learners long after they've left home and mom and dad are not there to say, Tommy, have you done your homework? And that has a lot of people freaked out today because our country was built by people who did what they were told. And by the way, we owe them a huge debt. We told them to do things and they did them. Unfortunately, in this age of acceleration, just doing what you're told to do will not buy you an average middle-class lifestyle anymore. So my example of intelligent assistant is the janitorial staff at Qualcomm. Qualcomm's another company I spent a lot of time with. I profiled their founder, Irwin Jacobs. Qualcomm actually made the inside of your iPhone. It was not made by Apple. The chips and the software are mostly made by Qualcomm. That's why Apple is always suing Qualcomm over patents. Anyways, Qualcomm has a 64-building campus out in San Diego, and 3 years ago, they took 6 of their buildings and they put sensors everywhere, on every light, door, window, faucet, drain, computer, AC, heating, cooling. They put sensors everywhere. They beamed all the data up to the cloud, and then they beamed all it back down into an incredibly user-friendly interface on an iPad. Qualcomm turned their janitors into maintenance technologists. Qualcomm's janitors now give tours to foreign visitors. What do you think that does for the dignity of a janitor? Because he or she now has an intelligent assistant, enabling them to learn faster and operate smarter. My last example, intelligent algorithm, is the partnership between Khan Academy, the online learning platform, and the College Board, the people who administer the PSAT and SAT exams. We all know the story. In 11th grade, our kids have to take the PSAT exam to determine their skills in verbal and math as preparation for taking the SAT exam in 12th grade to see if they get into Rice or some other school of their choice. We also know many American parents who can afford to go out and hire a tutor from Kaplan for $200 an hour to goose their kids' scores in verbal and math. Nothing wrong with it. Many of us did it. Unfortunately, a completely rigged game. Because if you came from a family or neighborhood that couldn't afford a $200 an hour tutor, couldn't even imagine that, you were at a real disadvantage. So 3.5 years ago now, Khan Academy and the College Board created an intelligent algorithm for free PSAT and SAT prep. Here's how it works. I go to take my PSAT in 9th grade. I get the results back. They say, Tom, you did really well in verbal. You could be a journalist. But you have a problem with math. Specifically, you have a problem with fractions and right angles. It then takes me to a practice site just for fractions and right angles, my exact weakness. If I do well there, it says, Tom, did you know you could be in AP Math? Advanced Placement Math? Moi? In AP Math? No one in my family's ever been in AP Math. No one in my neighborhood's ever been. You could be in AP Math. If I do well there, it takes me to another site that offers some 200 scholarships now for universities for people who do well there, and another site where young boys and girls in America at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America are shepherding other young boys and girls through this intelligent algorithm. Last year, over 3 million American kids got free PSAT and SAT prep on this intelligent algorithm. There is, in fact, folks, massive innovation going on all over the country on this pipeline of education to work, but no one's really telling anyone about it. One of the great failures today, I would say, of our political debate. That's the workplace. I'm going to skip over politics. We can talk how it's being reshaped. We can talk about that afterwards if you like. Let me go to geopolitics. How are my 3 accelerations reshaping geopolitics? After all, we're here at the Baker Institute at Rice. We got to talk about geopolitics. My chapter on this subject is built on the 1960s sitcom Get Smart. Now, some of you look my age, so you remember Get Smart was a spoof on James Bond, Don Adams. He had a shoe phone, Agent 99, Agent 86. Does anyone remember the name of the organization Don Adams worked for? Control. Very good. What was their worldwide enemy called? Chaos, spelled K-A-O-S. Well, I believe the authors of that show, the writers of that show, were ahead of their time. Because I believe in my age of acceleration, the most relevant geopolitical divide today is no longer north, south, east, west, communist, capitalist. It's actually between the world of control and the world of chaos, or what I call the world of order and the world of disorder. Let me explain. So, back in the 20th century, the world went from being governed geopolitically by empires to being governed by individual nation states. And across the 20th century, we got more and more individual nation states after World War I and World War II, to the point when in 1945, as the UN was born, we suddenly had 192 countries on the eve of the Cold War, separate nation states. In the 50 years of the Cold War, from the mid-1950s to the early 2000s, almost till a year like 2007, was a great time to be a weak little state. Oh, if you were a weak little state, That was your era. Why? First of all, there were two superpowers out there competing for your affection, to come to their side of the chessboard, throwing money at you, foreign aid, building your government house, educating your kids at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow or Wichita State in America. You could be Syria and lose 3 wars to Israel and get your army rebuilt for free all 3 times. Oh, it was great. Secondly, climate change was really moderate. Thirdly, everyone had a demographic dividend, lots of young people, few old people. No one had a cell phone or an internet to compare their leaders to the country next door. And China was not in the World Trade Organization, so everybody could be in the low-wage textile business. It was a wonderful time to be a weak little state. Now flash forward with me to the early 2000s. Now no superpower wants to touch you because all they win is a bill. Okay? No superpower wants to touch you at all. A second, climate change is now hammering these countries. I did a documentary last year on National Geographic about human migration in Africa from Senegal through Niger to Libya to Europe. Senegal today is already at 2 degrees rise average temperature since the Industrial Revolution. 2 degrees rise average temperature. Where have I heard that number? Oh, that's the number that the Paris Climate Agreement was designed to prevent by 2100. Senegal's already there. They're going to 4 degrees. Okay? Now everyone in the developing world has huge population explosion happening, and in the developed world, big demographic deficits, lots of old people, few young people. And most importantly, China's in the World Trade Organization, so nobody can be in the textile business. I was in Egypt for the Tahrir Square Revolution, and I was there for 3 weeks back in 2011, away from Mrs. Friedman. So after 3 weeks, I was coming home. I was at the Cairo airport. I went into the Treasures of Egypt souvenir shop to buy my honey something to remind her where I was. What do they have here? Let's see, pyramids, ashtrays. No, my honey doesn't smoke. Sphinx bookends. No, my honey's got plenty of bookends. Let's see, what do they have here? A stuffed camel with a honking hump. If you squeezed its hump, it honked, and I realized my honey didn't have a honking humped camel. So I took the camel, I went over to the cash register, put it down, turned it over. What did it say on the bottom? Say it with me now. Made in China. That's right. You're the lowest wage country in the Eastern Mediterranean, and someone half a world away can make your honking humped camel cheaper than you can, ship it halfway across the world, and sell it for a profit. So in other words, all these advantages have been completely erased. And what is that doing? It's taking these weak little states, and some of them are just blowing up, and others are becoming utterly frail, and they're just hemorrhaging their people and creating vast zones of disorder. In our hemisphere, it's particularly acute in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. By the way, the 3 most deforested countries in Central America, they cut down their trees, and we got their kids. And across the ocean, it starts in sub-Saharan Africa, goes all across North Africa, through the Middle East, right up to the border of India. Vast new zones of disorder. And the biggest geopolitical trend in the world today are millions of people, more people on the road today than at any time in our modern history, including after World War II, trying to get out of the world of disorder into the world of order. And this movement of people trying to get out of the world of disorder into the world of order is fundamentally changing the politics of the world of order, creating populist, nationalist backlashes from Europe right across the United States of America. That is how I think about geopolitics today. Let me close by talking about 2 realms you probably haven't thought that much about that are being reshaped: ethics and community. So my chapter on ethics is called, Is God in Cyberspace? Is God in cyberspace? Best question I ever got on book tour in 1999. I'm at the Portland Theater in Portland, Oregon. I'm selling my book, Lexus and the Olive Tree. Young man stands up in the balcony, question time, Mr. Friedman. Mr. Friedman, I have a question. I call on him. I can still see him up there in the balcony. And he asks me, is God in cyberspace? And I said, I have no idea. I felt like an idiot. So I got home, I called my spiritual teacher. He's a rabbi I got to know when I was a New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem. Zvi Marks, a brilliant Talmudic scholar, lives in Amsterdam, married to a Dutch priest, interesting character. I call Zvi up in Amsterdam, and I say, Zvi, I got a question I've never had before. Is God in cyberspace? What should I have said? And he said, well, Tom, in our faith tradition, we actually have two concepts of the Almighty, a biblical concept and a post-biblical concept. The biblical concept says the Almighty is almighty. He smites evil and he rewards good. And if that's your view of God, he sure isn't in cyberspace, which is full of pornography, gambling, cheating, lying, prevarication, people smearing one another on Twitter, and now we know fake news. But fortunately, he said, we have a post-biblical view of God, and the post-biblical view of God says God manifests himself by how we behave. So if we want God to be in cyberspace, we have to bring him there ourselves by how we behave in their cyberspace. Only we can bring God into cyberspace. I really liked his answer. I put it into the paperback edition of Lexus and the Olive Tree in the year 2000, where none of you saw it, and it sat there for 16 years. Anyways, I sat down to write this book, and I found myself spontaneously retelling that story. And so I finally sat myself down one day and said, why are you retelling that story? And it immediately became obvious to me it was for two reasons, and one just happened. I think in the last couple of years, we in the developed world began living 51% of our lives in cyberspace. That's now where you go to find a date, find a spouse, buy a book, write a book, buy a car, sell a car, get a mortgage, do your banking, do your brokerage, get your news, generate your news, watch your movies, and make your movies. That's where we're now living 51% of our lives. And what's my definition of cyberspace? It's a realm where we're all connected and no one's in charge. Yeah, there are no stoplights, you may have noticed, in cyberspace, no courts, no judges, no rules, no 1-800, please stop Putin from hacking my election. But that's where you're living 51% of your lives. In other words, you're living 51% of your lives in a realm that is fundamentally God-free. And at the same time, because of my three accelerations, we as a species are, for the first time in the history of our species, standing at a moral intersection we have never stood at before, and none of our predecessors have. In 1945, post-Hiroshima, we entered a world where one country could kill all of us. If it had to be one country, I'm glad it was mine. I think we're entering a world where one person can kill all of us, and where at the same time, all of us could actually fix everything. With these accelerated powers of men, women, and machines, we are entering an age where one of us could kill all of us, and all of us, if we put our minds to it, we actually now have the tools to feed, house, clothe, and educate every person on the planet. We have never been to this intersection before, where one of us could kill all of us, and all of us could basically fix everything. What is this intersection? What does it mean? It means we have never been more godlike as a species than we are today. Well, put those two together. We've never lived more of our life in a realm that is God-free, and we have never been more godlike. What does that mean? It means what every single person thinks, feels, and believes today really matters. It means every single person needs to be grounded in sustainable values, and at a minimum, the golden rule. And every faith and tradition and culture has their version of it. Do unto others as you wish them to do unto you, because we now live in a world where more people can do unto you farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. We have never been here before. Everyone needs to be in the embrace of the golden rule. I know what you're thinking. I actually gave this part of my talk as the commencement address a few years ago at Olin College of Engineering. And I told the parents there, I know what you're thinking. You paid 200 grand so your kid could get an engineering degree. And who do they bring in as the commencement speaker? But a knucklehead promoting the golden rule. Is there anything more naive? And what I told them is what I will tell you in this age of acceleration. When men, women, machines get this empowered and this interconnected and interdependent, naivete is the new realism. Because I'll tell you what's really naive. Thinking we're going to be okay when men, women, machines get this empowered and interconnected if everyone is not in the embrace of the golden rule. So where does the golden rule come from? Where do we learn that? Two places, I believe, primarily: strong families and healthy communities. That's where you learn to do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. I'm not an expert on strong families. I hope I built one, but I'd never presume to lecture you about my family. But I am an expert in healthy communities because I grew up in one. A little town in Minnesota outside of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park. And that's why my book, after all this talk of microchips and computers and AI and accelerations, ends with me going home to the little town where I learned the golden rule. So I'll just tell you briefly about it. It's the last 2 chapters of the book. Basically, is there some way they could, some way up? Is there?
There's somebody up there talking. I wish they would stop talking. We have a lecture going on down here.
Let's say it together.
It's just a little, are they done yet?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So my book ends by talking about this little town I grew up in Minnesota called St. Louis Park. The short story basically is my grandparents emigrated to Minnesota from Russia in the early part of the 20th century. Both my parents were born in Minneapolis. Minneapolis in the 20s and 30s, basically the entire Jewish community lived in a ghetto in the north side of the city with African Americans, not because we were integrated there, but because we were both isolated there, essentially. And Minneapolis in the 30s and 40s was the capital of anti-Semitism until Hubert Humphrey became mayor and cleaned it out of city government. Big hero in our house. After the war, the world opened up for the Jews, but not for the African Americans. And in a 3-year period between 1953, the year I was born, and 1956, the entire Jewish community of North Minneapolis moves out of North Minneapolis to one little town that could take them all, called St. Louis Park. Overnight, this little town goes from being 100% white, Protestant, Catholic, and Scandinavian to being 20% Jewish, 80% white, Protestant, Catholic, and Scandinavian. If Sweden and Israel had a baby, it would be St. Louis Park, okay? And thus began a really interesting experiment in inclusion. It was as if God said, I'm going to take these 2 communities and just throw them together and see what happens. So we, the Jews of Minnesota, we used to call ourselves the frozen chosen, were thrown together with these Scandinavians, these incredibly pluralistic Swedes, and together we had to figure out how to build a community. And I tell the story about how we did it. And there were broken dates and broken hearts and broken friendships, but over time, we built an interesting little community. You see, I actually grew up in the same town, in the same neighborhood, went to the same schools in the same decade with the Coen brothers, the filmmakers, Al Franken, the senator, Norm Ornstein, the political scientist, Michael Dell, the political theorist, Sharon Isbin, the guitarist, Mark Trestman, the coach of the Chicago Bears. We have our own Wikipedia page. It was a freaky place. We were not a neighborhood in the Upper West Side of New York. We were a one high school town in Minnesota. And the Coen brothers movie, A Serious Man, was about our town. In fact, if you saw No Country for Old Men, you may remember a scene where Churga blows up a car outside of a pharmacy in Mexico to go in and steal drugs. And at the end of the scene, the camera pans to the pharmacy. It's called Mike Zoss Drugs. That was our little St. Louis Park drugstore, okay? So there's all these homages. Fargo is about St. Louis Park. They called it Fargo, but it was really all about our little town. And what we learned there what we all were affected by is that we grew up in a time and place of decency and where politics worked. My mother was a radical liberal, and our congressman, my entire life, was a Republican named Bill Frenzel. And my mother would no more not vote for Bill Frenzel than she would not have voted for the man in the moon. And Bill Frenzel used to run, I got to interview him before he passed away, and he told me he used to simply campaign by buying a billboard on Highway 100 in Minneapolis, and it would just say Frenzel for Congress, and it wouldn't even say what party he was from. So we grew up in an environment that had a big impact on all of us. I took it into journalism. Yeah, that's where my goofy optimism comes from. Okay, Sandel took it into communitarianism, the Coen brothers into film, Ornstein into politics, Franken into politics. It had a big effect on all of us. It's this thing called Minnesota nice. Don't know how many of you are from Minnesota, have ever experienced Minnesota nice. You got to appreciate it's part of the culture. Hard to explain. I tell a couple stories in the book. When I was working on the book, I was home at my best friend Ken's wedding. Our other best friend Jay sat down at me at the table before the wedding started. He said, "Tom, my wife Eileen was driving on the ring road around Minneapolis today, and a man almost drove her off the road." And Jay told me that Eileen came home and said to him, "Jay, I was so mad I almost honked." That's Minnesota for road rage, okay? There was a Jewish mafia in Minnesota in the 30s and 40s around Prohibition. My dad grew up with these guys. I swear he was not in the mafia, but he did know them. And when I was 5 or 6 years old, my dad came home one day and said that one of his friends had been sent to jail. When you're a 5 or 6 year old kid and your dad comes home and he knows someone who's been sent to jail, that freaks you out. Which is why I never forgot what my dad said when I said to him, "Dad, what did he do?" And he said, "Son, he was shopping in a store before it was open." Okay, that's Minnesota for breaking and entering. Okay. So that is the culture I grew up in. Now you may have a little better idea, why I am who I am as a columnist. Anyways, I left Minnesota in 1971 to discover the world. And I came back in 2015 to write this book and discovered the world had found my little town. Now my high school is 50% white Protestant Catholic Scandinavian. It's 10% Jewish, it's 10% Latino now, and 30% Somali. The same little town that took the Jews 50 years ago, this time took the Somalis. Now the inclusion challenge is so much deeper and wider, racially and religiously. But ain't that the challenge of America today? Ain't that the challenge of Houston today? Ain't that the challenge of the world today? And that's why I basically end the book talking about how they're doing today and how they're doing it. And it's a struggle. There's no question, but my high school is still the 5th rated high school in the state of Minnesota with a very different demographic, but it's hard work. It's a struggle all the time. But what so impresses me today in writing this book and focusing on communities is how many communities are being led by people today who want to get caught trying. Not telling you there's success everywhere. We have a lot of communities in this country are withering. The opioid crisis is very real. But we also have communities that are creating complex adaptive coalitions, business educators, philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, and local government to thrive in this age of acceleration. Which is why, all the physics in this book, my teacher was a great physicist, Amory Lovins. And whenever people ask Amory, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Amory always says, I'm neither, because they're just two different versions of fatalism. Everything will be great. Everything will be awful. Amory says, I believe in applied hope. And I believe in applied hope. Don't know if it's going to work, but I'm going to apply my hope. And what impresses me as I travel around the country at the local level, the number of people applying hope. If you want to be an optimist today in America, stand on your head. The country looks so much better from the bottom up than from the top down. Not everywhere, not always, but in more places than you would think. And that's why my book and my talk ends with my theme song. My book had a theme song. I actually thought, could I buy this song? So when you open the book up, it would play this song like a Hallmark card plays Happy Birthday. song is by one of my favorite singers. Her name is Brandi Carlile, a great country folk singer. Some of you may be familiar with her. Her song, she has a song called The I, E-Y-E, that I believe is the anthem of our time. The main refrain is, I wrapped your love around me like a chain, but I never was afraid that it would die. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. You see, I think my 3 accelerations, I think they're a hurricane. I think there's a lot of leaders in the world who are telling us they can build a wall against the hurricane. I'm actually selling an eye that moves with the storm, draws energy from it. That's the healthy community where people can feel connected, protected, and respected. And it's based on dynamic stability, like riding a bike, not just trying to freeze everything in place. I think the great struggle in American politics going forward, and in politics all over the world, is today between the wall people and the I people. And my book is a manifesto for the I people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we have time for some questions, and before I have to go to the airport.
Terrific presentation. And identify yourself and please a question.
Please.
Mr. Friedman, thanks for a wonderful lecture. Just went and bought the 5th to the last book. So
oh, bless your heart. Thank you very much.
Ran out before it was over.
Thank you.
Quick question. It's very illuminating about the role of technology in the world. Can you comment a little bit on the role of technology you see in the Arab-Israeli conflict and in Israel, which is exploding in technology, and how that might be impacting the prospects for their incredible strength might impact their prospects of peace?
Well, you know, there's been a good book written about that, about Israel and technology, called Startup Nation, and Israel hugely benefited from the emigration of 1 million Russian Jews who had a strong technological background, you know, back in the Reagan administration, actually, that helped facilitate that. And it's an enormous asset, and it's allowed Israel in many ways to disconnect itself from the Middle East, because they can basically, when all you're making are bits and bytes, you know, you're not nearly as vulnerable as you were if you were making steel or growing fruit, you know, as in the past. There's actually a lot of cool stuff been going on in Jordan around technology. They have a really exciting startup pod, as does Dubai. Amazon.com has bought a couple of Arab startups, you know, in the last year. But, you know, this is going to be the challenge, because the asymmetry, whether you're Israelis and Palestinians or Koreans and Taiwanese, you know, the asymmetry between countries that can be part of the age of acceleration and those who will be left behind from it will be enormously destabilizing. That is just a huge technological education challenge now, because, you know, I know how hard it is. One of the things that makes me weep when I think about the Middle East today is you think about Syria, a country where, gosh, kids haven't been in school now for 7, 8 years. And so they were already behind, basically, you know, before this race started. But what if you take 7 or 8 years out of your youth bulge in terms of education? It's going to be enormously destabilizing. I think one of the challenges of our diplomacy is obviously going to be to try to level all of that out. But it's there right underneath the surface. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
I didn't know writers could be such good speakers.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You are both, and we are lucky to be here.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
You mentioned about how one person could destroy everybody on the planet by starting a nuclear war. What can we do to stop that? How can we take it away from one man's decision, like the man in the White House?
Right, sure. Not going to go there, but it's, you know, I wish I had, you're asking an important question, you know, broadly, and I wish I had a simple answer, because, you know, with technology, bad guys are always early adopters. You know, can see it around Bitcoin. You can see it around cyber crime today, you know. I'll give you one of my naive answers. And this is not the complete answer, but it's one answer that I think we have to think much more seriously about, that what we can control. I think we should be teaching digital civics in this country from kindergarten forward. Why is that? I think the internet is an open sewer of untreated, unfiltered information. Oh my God, it's got rubies and diamond and gold and pearls. But it's also got toxic waste material, radioactive material, cut glass, broken nails, and rusty cans. And if we don't build the internal software into our kids from kindergarten for how to interact with this open sewer, then we're going to have a huge problem. We're already seeing the deformations of that. You know, your kid may come home today and say, Dad, you heard that Tom Friedman guy speak. I just went on the internet. Did you know that the Minneapolis Sun-Sentinel said he actually was once convicted for shoplifting? And your kid says, Dad, I read it on the internet. When their first instinct has to be to check if there is something called the Minneapolis Sun-Sentinel, because there isn't. And so the first move you have to make with the internet is lateral. Is this a real source? Not, I read it on the internet. And so I think it's going to have to really change how we educate our kids. Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. Yeah.
Hi, sir. Thanks for your talk. I appreciate what you had to say about this chart here and what you've said about being lifelong learners.
Yeah.
But as you know, in fact, there are conferences that are being held, including one here, right, on the future of work.
Yes.
You know, the jobs are just going to just be shed.
Yes.
How can we?
How do we deal with that?
Yes.
Yeah, very good question. I do address that some in the book. So, you know, I am. There's sort of two challenges there. One is there's no question that if you're doing anything that would be called routine work, either white collar or blue collar, that is anything that is repetitive tasks that can be described by an algorithm, that therefore can be easily outsourced, automated, or digitized, you're in the wrong field. Okay. I think I might have a slide on this. I got to see if it was loaded here. Yeah. This is that blue line going up there. That's the number of people that are working with their minds. And the white line is the number of people working with their hands. So if you're doing any kind of routine work, so look at the blue line, that's non-routine work. You see where that's going. And the red line is routine manual work or routine white-collar work. You see where that's going. So if you're doing anything routine, you're going to be really challenged. And that therefore becomes a huge education challenge for you. How can you get into non-routine work? But I'm a little bit more of an optimist. You know, when I read these studies that say by the year 2050, 48.6% of all current jobs will have vanished. I always look at that and I think, 48.6, not 48.5. I love that little decimal. Who the hell knows what jobs are going to exist in 2050, you know? So the reason I'm a little skeptical is, and the one thing I'd urge you to do is go to Airbnb, their website. You'll notice if you call it up, there are actually two icons there now. One is called Homes. Hey, I'm coming to Houston for the Super Bowl. I want a home, rent a place. And the other now is called Experiences. Oh, click on Experiences. You will see tens of thousands of people around the world today monetizing their passions. Right now, there's someone in Houston offering a night tour of some, Houston bar scene. There's a day guide to things, how to make a piñata in Houston, how to make, tacos in Houston. You will have, the most popular one is a guy who does wolf tours in Washington State, excuse me. But this is every city in the world. I wrote about it a couple of years ago, a mother who'd gone to Havana, and there was someone offering night tours of 3-man basketball games in Havana, $35 a person, limit of 5, and you get a mojito at the end. And the mother wrote in the comments section, I couldn't get my son to come home after it was the highlight of our visit. So people, God bless them, have bodies and souls. And the minute you underestimate, their creativity, they come up and bite you in the bottom with a 3-man basketball tour in Havana. So I don't know where this is going to go, and I know everyone needs more education, but I'm not as worried as everybody else about the 48.6 1.6, okay? And I think that we may surprise ourselves. Yeah.
Thomas, thank you so much for your time. I'm Manuel Delgado. I'm with Expo USA, trying to bring a World's Fair to the US first, and then ultimately to Houston by 2030.
Yeah.
Talking about that Minnesota Nice, I've had the chance to work with the Minnesota World's Fair team.
Oh, great. Oh, I saw that a little bit, yeah.
Yes, I know you had.
Yeah.
And so they're so nice. And we found that we had that in common. I think there's that Houston Nice thing, and the running joke is that we started to call them Snow Houstonians.
Snow Houstonians, that's very good.
But my question is specifically about World's Fairs.
Yeah.
People say that because of technology, World's Fairs are no longer relevant.
Yeah.
And we actually argue that it's the opposite.
Yeah,
because
totally.
World's Fairs offer the opportunity for interaction and the world's strongest tool of cultural diplomacy. So I wanted to get your thoughts about World's Fairs in general, and how would you see a World's Fair?
I'm not an expert on World's Fairs, but I would just tell you your basic instinct is right. I think the more people are home alone with their screens, one of the most interesting interviews I did with this book was with Vivek Murthy, our Surgeon General. Amazing Indian-American doctor. Unfortunately, Trump fired him, but he's a great guy. And I interviewed him one day, and I said, Vivek, what's the most prevalent disease in America? Is it cancer, diabetes, or heart disease? He said, oh, it's none of those, Tom. It's isolation. Depression-related isolation. I said, wait a minute. We're living in the most connected age in history, and you're telling me the most prevalent disease is isolation? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. That tells me we really need a World's Fair. Okay. What is the reason my book is called Thank You for Being Late is not only the opening anecdote. It's because I actually believe in this age of acceleration, the more everything old and slow matters more than ever. I think today, the faster the world gets with all this technology and websites, internet, the more all the things you cannot download, all the things you have to upload the old-fashioned way, good parent to good child, good teacher to good student, good pastor to good flock, good friend to good friend, all that stuff matters so much more today. That's why I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I know who my friends are. They're not a thumb up or a thumb down. And anything you write about me anonymously in 140 characters, I have to tell you, I don't care. Okay? Okay? I don't care. Okay? And so I'm really into old and slow. Because that's the stuff that really matters most. And that's what a World's Fair is all about. Please.
Yes, would you comment on the current situation in Saudi Arabia?
Is something going on there? Yes, sir.
And how you think Washington should handle it?
Yeah, really good question. Next question over here. So you seem very anxious to get to the microphone. No, I'm going to answer your question. Well, the secretary and I and Ed, had lunch and really talked a huge amount about this. And I'll just tell you what I'm thinking about and wrestling with, and where I think the story is going to go, because the story is so complicated. I'm not going to go back to the beginning, but running foreign policy, as Secretary Baker can tell you, is always a challenge and a tension between our interests and our values. This story is going to test that tension between our interests and our values like nothing you have seen, as I was saying to the Secretary, since Tiananmen Square. First of all, I believe tragically that I think I happen to know both Jamal Khashoggi and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Probably one of the few people who do. And I don't have the evidence in front of me, but I have a strong suspicion that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is responsible for the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, and that will come out. And I think that's a heinous thing. And as a journalist, I particularly feel it's a heinous thing, And so when it comes to the tension between my values and my interests, okay, I know I'm going to be dictated by what my values say, which is that people should not be allowed to get away with this. It's a terrible thing. But I'm not President of the United States. I'm not Secretary of State, okay? And so there you can already see the tension appearing. The president said, wait a minute, we sell these guys $110 billion in weapons. You know, maybe it was a rogue operation, okay? And even in fairness, what you're seeing there is this tension. And then the next minute he says, this is terrible, and if it's true, it's terrible, and we have to do something about it. And so what we're gonna have a big fight about in the coming weeks is where this gets resolved, because many in Congress are going to invoke the Global Magnitsky Act that says we have the right to and are empowered to sanction any world leader who would engage in this kind of heinous behavior. Now, the president can overrule that, and the Congress can overrule that if they have a majority. But there's going to be a big fight about that. Now, wait a minute. We could face a situation where the future ruler of Saudi Arabia cannot come to the United States, okay? And is under sanction from us. And the interest people will tell you, we have interest in selling them arms. We have interest in them as a bulwark against Iran. And they're one of the world's largest oil producers. How can we do that? Then over on the other side, there are people like me saying, but we can't let this go. We can't let this go. It's going to be a huge tension there. And now I'm going to make it even more difficult for you, okay? Because I've written 6 columns, about this over the last year, Saudi Arabia, MBS, and whatnot. And my view of him, from my first column to my last, is that he had huge upside and huge downside. And our job was to encourage the upside and try to control the downside. That's why before he came here to Houston, I actually wrote a column that was a memo from the US ambassador to Saudi Arabia to President Trump about how we encourage the upside and curb the downside. But it was a phony memo because we don't have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia, okay? And so I was pretending I was the ambassador and sending him a memo, okay? So here's what's going to make it doubly difficult. I happen to believe that in my lifetime, 9/11 was actually the worst thing that happened to my country in my lifetime. It was not only bad in and of that it killed 3,000 of our brothers and sisters, but led us on several foreign wars to create a Department of Homeland Security, put metal detectors everywhere, and spend trillions of dollars that could have gone into roads and bridges and schools. It was a terrible event. Now that event, that 9/11, is traced back to, I believe, the Salafist ideology that was spread from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, okay? And I had a big beef with them after 9/11. I went to war with them over that. And one of the things that bothered me about our policy toward these oil producers was we basically said to them for many years, guys, it was only guys, here's the deal. Here's the deal. Keep your pumps open, your price is low, and don't bother the Israelis too much. And you can do whatever you want out back. You can treat your women however you want. You can preach from your mosque whatever you want. You can put whatever crazy-ass conspiracy theories in your newspaper that you want. You can do whatever you want out back. Just keep your pumps open, your price is low, and don't bother the Jews too much. And on 9/11, we got hit with the distilled essence of everything that was going on out back. So I vowed after 9/11, I was going to war over that. And if you followed my stuff, I did. And basically, my criticism of the Saudi leadership was we would come to them and we'd say, arrest that cleric, he's saying crazy stuff. They'd arrest him. We'd say, pick up that guy, he's threatening us. They'd pick him up. But one thing they never did, they never fought the war of ideas. Because they had this little bargain back home. They let the clerics do whatever they wanted. They blessed the Saudi ruling family, and the Saudi ruling family blessed the clerics. And it was a nice little deal, but that we were ultimately victims of, and they were as well. What interested me, what intrigued me about MBS, first time I ever heard a Saudi leader actually say publicly to the clerics, I'm not here to reinterpret Islam. I'm here to restore Islam. I've got the real Islam, you don't. He's the first one who ever dared to fight the war of ideas with these guys in public. And yes, he arrested a bunch of them, and a bunch of liberals, and a bunch of women. That's a big downside, but big upside. And that's what's going to make this dilemma even more. I wish I could tell you that there were 100 Saudi princes with the steel, the bullying, the daring to do half the crazy stuff he did, okay? But there aren't. So we're going to have to figure out how to sanction him and not sanction all the Saudi people, and how to sanction him and not blow up the most important thing, I think, for us, the reform of Islam in the modern age. Oh my God, this is going to be so difficult, but Donald Trump is on the case. What could go wrong? Yes.
So I'm a current student here at Rice, but I'm also the product of a small one high school town like
Great.
you.
Where? From where?
Fort Davis, Texas.
Wow.
Yes.
Cool.
So one thing that I've personally witnessed throughout my life is the effects of brain drain and the lack of educational access in small communities. In fact, when I came to Rice, I was applauded for getting out. Wow. So what do you see as the solution to that issue?
It's a really good question. You know, I think that one of the things I've seen in studying communities is that what's happening is the ones that I did a speaking tour across the state of Tennessee earlier this year, Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville. And Knoxville is like so hot today. It's a college town, University of Tennessee. They're so in need of workers, they're now busing workers from 2 hours away. You know, so I think what's going to happen is the most dynamic of these towns will begin to absorb the less dynamic ones. The other thing that's going to happen is eventually, one of my daughters lives in San Francisco, one lives in Washington, D.C. So they're both living in the city, you know. But I can see a time where the city is just going to get so dense, so crowded, hey, they might want to live in a smaller place now out of the city, be totally wired and connected to the world. So I'm hoping some of this will balance out. But the other thing I'm hoping for, things like that intelligent algorithm that Khan Academy has, and there are many others. But it is a real problem. We just this year passed, now more than half the world lives in cities, you know, and the direction is clearly going, you know, that way. But hopefully this will be a phase that will eventually balance itself out. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I got to go to the airport. I forgot. Sorry, you guys. Thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.